Hi, in the previous video, we stopped at a point where we want to define the views classes, which will receive the request and process them. So far we have the model and the serializer. Now we need two more things, which is the views and the URLs, where we will define the paths that any HTTP client could call, and Django would resolve it and route it to the right views. So actually, as we are going to build these four APIs, which is basically an API with four resources, I will group them in a way that follows the best practice that Django REST framework provide, which is an APIs that will require a route parameter to define the entity or the object you want to deal with. That's in case you want to update a specific item of the to-do list, or if you want to delete a specific item, you have to pass the ID of that item for these two requests to be able to update or delete it. And the other two requests where you don't have really to send the ID of a specific item, when you create an item, which does not exist yet, and when you return a list of all the available items in your to-do list. So we will create two classes. The first one is class to-do list. That's what Django REST framework recommends, but it's not going to work in our case, so I'm just going to call it collection. It's just a name. Feel free to name it whatever. And the other class is going to be class to-do list detail, meaning it worries about a specific item. The other meaning is to pass an ID in the path when you make your call. Okay, so here we have the two classes. Now, each method in these classes will represent the method, the HTTP method. In create, we'll create, define a create function, and in edit, we will create a put method, as we will see in a second. So first, we want to import a couple of libraries from REST framework, which will help us write these class-based views. From REST framework .views import API view. There are multiple classes that Django REST framework provide to help with writing the views, and I found this is one of the simplest. There are other classes. You could go to Django REST framework documentation and read more about them, but today's example is only about the API view. The other package we want from REST framework is the status. The other class that we need is the response that will be handling returning a proper response to the UI. So from REST framework import response, but first we want to import actually from response import response, and the status is to set the HTTP status, for instance 200 or 201 for create. Okay, so the first method here to return a list of available items in the to-do list. So the method's going to be define get request, and the first argument usually self, and the second is request. That will be populated automatically with the incoming request information, and that's about it. The next thing we want is to define from where to get the data. So we need to import from here, import models, and from models import the to-do list model. And also we want to import the serializer to be able to read the model data and convert it to an object. Import to-do list serializer. Okay, so it's pretty simple. We will say items equal to-do list objects all. This is the ORM of Django, so you don't have to use an explicit queries to grab the data of the table. You could just use the objects attribute of the model and run any queries you want, which called query sets. Go to the Django documentation and look at query sets. So all mean grab all the items in the table. We have to serialize it. Equal to do list serializer, and we have to pass to the serializer is the items. And just because we are returning multiple items from the table, we need to pass another argument to the serializer called many equal true. And the last thing is to return response and the serializer.data. The serializer.data is an attribute that holds the object of the data that's coming back from the model here. Okay, that's done. The next API is to create a new item. So it's going to be post, lowercase, self request, and that's it. We want to define now the serializer, to do list serializer, and the serializer here is going to get the data from the request, meaning the payload that you are going to send, we are passing it to the serializer, so the serializer will do the other way of data transformation. It's going to transform the data format of the request from object into something the model could understand by passing data equal and the object. Okay, next we want to say if serializer dot is valid, then we will save the serializer and return response that says that first return the data and also alter the status of the request to be 200, from 200 to 201. So it's going to be status dot http 201 created, and that's from the package we have imported from REST framework. Okay, now what if the data is not valid? We will need to return response saying, well, here is the errors that the serializer found, and we will have to adjust the status of the request to status.http 400 bad request. So bad request meaning the UI will have, or the client will have to go find out what's wrong with the request, or if they have missed any parameter. Okay, so these two APIs are done. And now we want to create an API that will delete an item. So under the detail, we need to say define delete self request. And here we need the primary key of the item that we want to delete. And from there, we would just say item equal to do list dot object dot get primary key equal primary key, or you could say ID in the model equal the primary key variable that we're passing here. And from there, we want to delete the item. We'll just say item dot delete, and we will return response saying, we will just alter the status and say status.http 204 no content in this request, meaning we don't have to return a body for this request. This API, believe it or not, is done too. The last one where we want to update a specific item, define put self request, and we also need the primary key of the item that we want to alter, and we'll have to say here we first need to grab the item dot get by ID equal primary key that we're getting from the client, and then we will have to serialize it equal to do list serializer, and in serializer we pass the item that we just brought from the database, and we don't have to pass many equal true because we are getting only one item in this request. But here we want to specify the data equal request.data, meaning update the data of this item with whatever we are passing here. So what the serializer will do, first it will transform the format of this data into something the model could understand and then apply it to this item. And as above here, we need to make sure the client, they have passed a valid object that the serializer could use to update the item. So here we would say is valid, then serializer dot save, and return response telling the client that the request was processed correctly by returning serializer.data, by returning the data. And we will not have to alter the HTTP status because the default status is 200. And in case if there was an error, we will return the errors that the serializer found, and we will have to adjust the status into status HTTP 400 bad request. Okay, at this point we're done, but we forgot the most important thing is to inherit from the API view in both classes. Okay, at this point, these two classes are done, and the methods that reflect these APIs or these methods are done. Here we have the collection call, which will grab all the items. Here we will create an item by passing the request with the payload. And then in the second class, in the detail class, we could delete an item by passing the ID of the item. And the second one in this class, and the final function that we need to define is the put, where we need to pass the ID of the item. And in the payload, we will just pass the new value that we want to replace for that specific item. So now we only need to define the URLs and route them to the right view. To do that, we need to go to the main app, then to the URLs file under that main app folder. And here we will find we have only one path defined. So let's define two paths. One for the collections, which is basically creating a new post where the client doesn't have to pass an ID for the item. And the second one is to return the collection. So the path is going to be to do list / and we will route it to a specific view by saying views. And first we need to import that view from to-do list import views. And here basically we'll call just a class to-do list collection. And just because this is a class-based view, we need to add as view. The second path is going to be to-do list, and we need to specify that user must pass an integer after the slash in the path, and that integer will represent the item that the client wants to update or delete. So we need to route this request to views.to-do-list-detail, where we have the put and the delete methods. And we shouldn't forget about asView. And asView comes from the old versions of Django, had the views to be functions only, not a class based, and therefore the path function here expects a function to be passed here instead of a class. So the Django developers provided as view which will do the job for us. So anytime you use a class-based view, you have to say as view. Okay, at this point we can just test our APIs. So let's do it. Let's go to localhost 8080, and that's what we defined in the Docker compose. And actually we want to, here you could see that Django tells you that we have 3 URLs: admin, to-do list, and to-do list with an integer. So let's go to the first one, to the collection, to-do list. This is very neat. This is provided from Django REST framework, a UI to interact with APIs out of the box, which tells you when you call this URL, it did a request, and the request comes back with a 200 OK status error, and the list is empty. We don't have any items yet. Now let's add an item. We need to pass an object that has the description, one item which is the description, and the description is the item that we want to add to the to-do list. It's going to be my first item. See, it was added, and here's the ID. Now if I just refresh again, see this, here's the first one. If you want to add a second item, my second item, you can see there are 2. Now if I go to this URL again, we have 2 items in the list. Now we have one more path where we could go to individual item to edit or delete. We need just to pass the ID of that item. 2 does not exist. We have at least 4. Okay, get is not allowed. That's because we haven't defined get method. If you go back here and we go to the views, we have only delete and put. Let's do put here. Description. We are updating the item number 4, which is my second item. We will just update that with my second item updated. Okay, that was updated. Let's go back and verify. Here's my second item was updated. Well, I was updating the first one. Actually, the second one had the ID 5. Let's update the first one back to what it was. My first item. And then if we go to number 5 here, we could actually just delete it. Okay, 204, no contents that we have specified. Let's go back to the main list. We have only 1 item. So that's a demonstration of first fetching a list of items, being able to post, meaning create a new item, and go to an individual item by passing the ID. And this is basically the syntax that we have here in the URLs. And also we deleted an item. So one thing I wanted to mention, this is not the best practice that you use the main URLs to put your put your subdirectory directory URLs, or to put your applications, individual application URLs. The best practice is to copy this file, paste it there inside each application you have, and you go here, delete the things that you don't need, like the admin and all that comments. Remove the first one. The views could be replaced with dot. We need the path. Now we need to move this to an upper level. We will just say we have these 2 URLs, and we'll go to the main URL, and we will just import that URL's file. by saying here we need to grab the include package from the URLs, and we will just say include and the application name, which is to-do list, dot the file name URLs. And that should be the same as defining the paths here, but when we have 10, 20 apps, you want to control the URLs at the app level instead of having all of them here. That's a best practice. It's up to you if you want to follow it. Okay, let's try it. This should work just fine, as you can see here. If I go back to the main list, there you go. All right, so to this point, that's how you could create a full CRUD API, starting with the model, serializer, and views, and then the last thing is the URLs that will be the entry point for your views actually, and you route them based on your request. Now, one thing I wanted to mention before ending this video is that what is the reason I was passing this object like that and just work my third item. And that's because the only item that is required by our model is the description, and it's called description, DESC. That's the short for description. That's what we have to pass, because here in the post we are asking the serializer to verify what the client is sending is right. The serializer will go to the model, examine the class, and make sure all the attributes here that are required have been passed, and in our case we have only one. Okay, so to this point, this is the wrap up of our video. If you have any question in regards to the steps I've done, please leave me that in a comment. I'll get to you as soon as possible. And if you like my videos, please subscribe to the channel and give me a thumbs up, and see you in the next videos.